Okay, so this is part two of the World War II lecture in preparation for your quiz on Friday. Part one was about how the United States was drawn into war. And so, to contextualize a little bit, Japan has bombed Pearl Harbor in order to try and dominate the Pacific theater, right? And U.S. presence within Hawaii, Midway, Guam, and the Philippines prevented them from doing that. And so they attacked Pearl Harbor in order to kind of get a jump start. In part three, we will talk about the battles a little bit and how that kind of played out for them. This lecture is mostly for you to understand the impact that the war had on the home front. So the focus question for this lecture is, how did the war transform the American economy and society in many ways more dramatically than the New Deal? So think about the New Deal in that FDR was trying to stimulate the economy, right, by pump priming, by creating jobs, investing in infrastructure in order to put money in the hands of the people in order for them to go out and spend that money and kind of stimulate and creating jobs and spending money in the economy in order to help kind of get it jump started. Now we'll never really know if that was going to play out and actually work because Pearl Harbor happened. But what we are going to figure out is that the government is going to spend a lot of money during World War II, and you're going to see how that's going to impact the economy. So the first thing we need to talk about is how the federal government mobilizes in order to defeat the Axis powers. The role of the federal government expands well beyond that of what it did during World War I and the New Deal. So make sure that you understand that. The success of the Allied powers. So again, remember, by this point, Germany is pretty much occupying most of Europe. They have attacked the Soviet Union, so we are allies with the Soviet Union. France is completely occupied. I mean, you've got kind of the puppet state. You've got Vichy France, but really our only ally is, the United Kingdom. Britain is kind of barely hanging on. So when we are spending this money and we are mobilizing and we are building, we are doing it for all of the Allied powers. Especially Britain and France, and then all of their, like you have Canada and Australia and South Africa and all of that. And the success depends on that. So a couple different things, boards are created. So one is the War Production Board. This is going to manage all wartime industries, right? So you're looking at anything that they need, that they're going to be the ones overseeing that. So today we talked a little bit about how during this outbreak, the coronavirus outbreak, there are a lot of things that are kind of needed right now that we are not prepared. We don't have, and there's been a lot of talk about mobilizing. Is it the job of the government to come in and say, "Hey GM, hey Ford, you're making ventilators now. Hey Hanesbrands, you're making medical supplies for our healthcare workers." That's kind of what's being discussed right now, and that's why you hear the reference of like wartime president. But back during World War II, that was the expectation. The government came in and they said, "This is what we need, and this is what you're going to produce." The Office of War Mobilization set production priorities. And the biggest thing is controlling raw materials. So any type of contractor, and these are private companies, were paid for a cost, right, for what it costs for them to make it, plus a certain percentage of profit. And we'll talk about how that's going to help industry a little later on. And then the Office of Price Administration this is where it's going to affect people's everyday life the most. They froze prices and wages and rent. They promoted rationing of commodities, meat, sugar, gas, tires, tin, anything and everything, steel. Like they're not buying automobiles at this time. That is being rationed and used and conserved to produce B-52 bombers and jeeps and ships and things like that. Now, this is going to cost a lot of money. So federal spending increases by 1,000%. between 1939 and 1945, the gross national product was up 15% each year of the war. And so what we learned here is that the government can spend its way out of a depression. Where the New Deal, we're talking about, billions of dollars, um, or millions of dollars. We're looking at billions of dollars during World War II. So by 1945, the national debt was at $250 billion. That was 5 times what the debt had been in 1941. And the reason being is because we view the fiscal policy differently after the New Deal, and that starts with FDR, and that's a really important turning point. Is the role of the government um, can be it's not the kind of hands-off, laissez-faire type view. It's going to be more about what do we need to get done, what do we need to spend in order to do it, and deficit spending is how we're going to do that. And that's why it kind of makes sense today as to why we are trillions of dollars in debt, and why you even see the stimulus package that's being suggested today, is that is kind of the standard. When the people need the government's going to step in and spend the money, whether we have that money or not. We'll kind of figure it out from there. Okay, so looking at these industries, um, these companies are going to be exceeding production and profits. That's I think the important part of the 1920s because of that wartime demand. There's pretty much unemployment rate is non-existent during the war. So between the fact that you have the millions of soldiers that are serving overseas, the men and women in this war, and women are working. You have African Americans. The Great Migration is still going on, and so people are working. War-related industrial output in the United States was twice that of the Axis powers combined. So a lot of people say, the United States and how we defeated Hitler. We defeated Hitler by spending and by production and by industry. So for synthesis, if you're trying to make some sort of connection, think about the Union during the Civil War, and how one of the reasons that the Union was able to defeat the Confederacy, and granted, it still took 4 years, right? The same thing with World War II. Like, it was very difficult to invade. That D-Day invasion was a really important turning point. The same thing with the Civil War. Even though they're outproducing, I mean, that was one of the reasons that they were able to kind of, for the war to last as long as it was, is because they were outproducing. And so you can kind of make that connection between industry and war and how successful you can be there. Instead of automobiles, you got tanks. You have B-52s rolling off of Ford assembly lines. They're producing 300,000 planes, 100,000 tanks within that time period. Shipyards became so efficient. Every 14 days, a new battleship was ready for action. Production, though, was concentrated mostly with the largest corporations. So this really hurt a lot of small businesses. They didn't get these government contracts, and so they weren't really able to keep up. So the 100 largest corporations accounted for 70% of wartime manufacturing. So it was hard for those smaller businesses to be able to compete. And so here are some images of shipyards and factories of that time. And again, a lot of these places you would see women working in these factories. Okay. Something else a little different, unprecedented, is the Office of Research and Development, and it was established to contract scientists and academics. They use universities to help in the development of these technological advancements for war. So radar and sonar, I think I mentioned in the last lecture that radar was around, but it was not very trustworthy. The technology just wasn't quite there yet. And so that was one of the reasons why we weren't able to know Pearl Harbor, why it was kind of like such a surprise. Penicillin is probably going to be one of the most important scientific discoveries. If you remember making connections to previous wars, the number one reason that most men died during war was because of disease. So penicillin is an antibiotic, right? So when we talked about gangrene during the Civil War, Penicillin would have knocked that out. You have jet engines and rockets, so like jet propulsion, and then the top secret Manhattan Project, which was the project that developed the atomic bomb. The irony in all of this is a lot of these scientists that participated in this were European that had fled fascist persecution, and so they're the ones that are going to be contributing. Albert Einstein was one of those scientists. Okay, so we talked about industry. Now we need to talk about labor. Labor unions and large corporations agreed that they weren't going to have any strikes during the war. However, when they start realizing that these corporations are making huge profits during this time, but at the same time, remember that wages are frozen. And so they become a little disgruntled over that, and they start talking of strikes. In particular, one about coal, and that was a major deal because you're looking at natural resources and obviously energy. And so Congress passed the Smith-Conley Anti-Strike Act, which basically what it did, and FDR vetoed it. I'll explain in a second, but basically what it did is if there was an industry that was talking about going on strike, the government could then take over that business, so basically nationalize it, and then they would kind of be in charge. So if like Ford Motor Company, if their union said, nope, we're not building those B-52s, right? We want better wages. The government could come in and take over that country, that industry. Now, the reason that FDR vetoed it is at the time. Remember, he is the New Deal guy. He is the I don't want to say the idea of like government and labor. Remember, like the Wagner Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act of the 1930s. Like that's what he kind of was known for. However, in 1944, he will kind of invoke the law. He'll use it in regards to the railroads for a brief period of time. Now, how do we pay for all this? Um, well, obviously, there's deficit spending for sure. But in addition to that, they're going to increase the income tax. So this is the first time that most Americans are required to pay, but they're working, so that's fine. And they're rationing, right? So we'll talk more about that as well. By 1944, taxes are withheld from paychecks. So instead of you owing money at the end of the year, they're going to take that money from the paycheck. Hopefully something's popping into your head right now. Where did they get that idea? Social Security, which is, remember, a New Deal policy. And then the other thing is selling war bonds, right? $135 billion in war bonds. They're going to give that money, again, like cash in the hand of the government to pay for the war. And they're going to try and convince you that you need to buy these war bonds. And again, so the shortage of consumer goods did make it easier for people to save money. And that's going to be really helpful after the war because people, I mean, that's going to be, so this is your greatest generation, right? So that's what they're kind of called. These are the people that are going to give birth to the baby boomers. So one of the reasons that after the war, you have this increase in like people buying homes and buying cars and having children was because they were able to save money during the war. So the use of propaganda was due to the Office of War Information. Very few people opposed the war, and that's because we were attacked. The main purpose of the propaganda was to maintain morale, and then also to encourage conservation of those resources and increase production. So, and again, just to kind of remind you, like, this is why we're doing it. And it's kind of crazy that we're studying this right now with what's going on. Um, I think most of us, like, that as we're in isolation and we're social distancing, like, it's gonna get hard, especially since we're only, like, 1 week in. And so it's gonna get harder, and so what you'll start to see, and I've already seen a CDC, Center for Disease Control, commercial that's kind of explaining, like, why. Like, they're going to start trying to explain to us and try to help with morale. Now we have, social networking where we can all like share and kind of have that commonality and like this is how we're struggling. They didn't have social media at that point in time, and so this was them trying to be uplifting and try to keep people motivated, like, this is gonna be worth it, and it's kind of the same thing right now. If we just isolate ourselves right now, hopefully it'll save lives, it'll help our hospital workers, and hopefully this could be over with so we can kind of move on. Um, the Office of War Information recruited movies, radio, popular music, everything is reflecting cheerful, patriotic view of the war. You can remember from the first lecture, Norman Rockwell's Four Freedoms posters. Um, this piece of propaganda is one of my favorites. So when you ride alone, you ride with Hitler. Join a car sharing club today. Because basically the idea is that you need to be carpooling to save those resources. Because if we're not saving those resources, that's going to allow for the Axis powers to defeat us. And so I've got a couple slides here of just different examples. And so I want you to kind of think about with this one on the left, you give us the fire, we'll give them hell. Let's go, everybody, keep them firing. Like, who is the intended audience for this? And that would be factory workers, right? You know, we're over here doing this. So here you have this brave pilot. More than likely, if you're working in a factory, there's a reason why you're working in that factory and you're not overseas serving. And so a lot of men kind of struggled with that. If you think of like Captain America, okay, I know I'm going there, but if you think of Captain America, right, he wanted to serve, he wanted to bring honor to himself and his family, but he couldn't. And so a lot of people struggled with that. And so what's the one thing that you can do? You can be worth you are worth something. You're in that factory and you're providing the ammunition for us. Um, Here's one on the left. You have in unity there is strength, and you have Uncle Sam between the laborer and the businessman, right? We saw one of these that was similar from World War One. Loose lips might sink ships. This is actually coming to from World War One, where you want to like make sure that you're not talking, especially if you're working in certain industries or technologies. You don't want to talk about what your business is doing because that could affect the work because there are spies everywhere. Now, this is a really important slide. There was a LEQ or a short answer question a couple years ago. It was LEQ last year, actually. It was about migration patterns. An increase in these factory jobs caused millions of people to move from rural areas to different places where the federal government had created new industries. So construction and new factories, military bases, most of them are moving to what we call the Sun Belt. There's a huge migration. You have military bases that are being built in southern states and in the West, like in California and Arizona, New Mexico. Alabama, you have Fort Bragg in North Carolina. In addition to that, some factories are moving and some industries are moving south. You're going to see that trend happen more in more recent history, more in the last 30, 40 years, because it's cheaper. The land is cheaper. The cost of living is lower, so you don't have to pay your employees as much. And so there's that major shift. Probably most of you, your parents or grandparents moved from New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, the Midwest, and there's just kind of that trend. Now today, California is super expensive to live in, but again, like there are certain industries that people are motivated in moving there. But overwhelmingly, people start moving to what we call the Sun Belt. And with that, it's important to understand that their money goes with them, right? So more money is now moving into the South, as well as their votes. So a lot of these southern states start to pick up some electoral votes, which is really important for the presidential elections. What else is important about the Sun Belt migration is if you think about kind of those carpetbaggers after the Civil War, right? They're moving down to kind of take advantage of the poverty that existed in the South at that time period. Because again, it's just cheaper to live, it's cheaper to work, or to have a business. And so they're trying to take advantage of that during the war. And that's going to continue like post-war for sure during the Cold War. Now for African Americans, again, this is the continuation of the Great Migration. So over 1.5 million African Americans moved out of the South during World War II. 1 million African American men served in the armed forces, again in segregated units. Actually, the Navy was integrated, but they worked in certain positions. So they were assigned, like, to be the cook on the ship or the janitor or something like that, but that was integrated. The Navy was the first to integrate. Um, you're gonna have race riots in 1943 because of discrimination. A lot of civil rights leaders, though, are trying to encourage African Americans to adopt the double V slogan. So victory over fascism abroad, and victory at home for like with democracy at home. And and I know that, Du Bois tried to do the same thing in World War One. There is a reason why the civil rights movement happens during or right after World War II. And that's because kind of enough was enough. And the same thing with in World War One. If you think about the Great Migration, and you think about the Harlem Renaissance and finding pride and strength within African American communities once they got out of the South, the same thing is going to happen after World War II. Membership in the NAACP is going to increase during the war. You have your first civil, not, yeah, I guess first civil rights organization, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, and again, they're there to kind of create, um, improve the lives of African Americans. It will be one of the most important civil rights organizations during the 1950s and 60s. The Executive Order 8802 said that if a government that has a contract, right, with the federal government to produce any type of wartime good, they cannot discriminate. So African Americans need to be paid the same as whites. It affected like segregated bathrooms. Well, no, not segregated bathrooms, but they had to be paid the same. In Smith v. Allwright, they said that it was unconstitutional to deny membership in political parties to African Americans. That was something that they used in order to prevent them from voting in primaries, right? So you can vote in the general election, but you couldn't vote in the primary, and they said that was unconstitutional. For Mexican Americans, most of them are going to work in the defense industries. 300,000 were served in the military. Now, the Bracero program is important to understand. It was basically it allowed for one of the things that they needed was farmers. So between the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, a lot of Americans moved off of those farms, and that kind of created a problem for us because we needed the farms in order to produce the food in order to send overseas, and then other things as well. And so the Bracero program allowed for Mexican migrant farm workers to come over the border, and basically, like, it just kind of limited the immigration process. Like, if you were a migrant worker, like, that was it. Like, you could just come over, and then you would go back. And that was really a part of our kind of our relationship even after World War II. Eventually, we will, limit that, but it's actually much later than you think, but we'll talk about that when we get there. Um, discrimination-wise, there is an example with the Zoot Suit riot. You're gonna have to Google a Zoot Suit. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of historical Zoot Suits. So the best way for me to explain it is like a gangster type costume. This is how you would think of it today, is like a gangster costume, right? With the long jacket and the, kinda like baggy pants or whatever you might find. But if you Google historical zoot suit, it was a trend. And most of the time you would have to get these zoot suits. They'd be a little bit more expensive. And in Los Angeles, it was a trend, especially with the Mexican American community. And so what happened is some American sailors were on leave. That they pulled into California and they saw these men in their zoot suits, and they were like, it kind of created some animosity because these are white men that are serving in the military, and they see these Mexican Americans in their fancy suits, and they're like, well, what are you sacrificing? And so it kind of created some tension. And I will say it's mostly Mexican American youth that would wear these zoot suits. Japanese American, excuse me, American Indians. This is not in your textbook, but I feel like it's really important to know because I think it's a really cool story. 25,000 served in the military, especially the Navajos. The Navajo, from southwestern United States, they were recruited by the Marines in the Pacific Theater because the Japanese could not figure out the Navajo language. They could not figure out the codes. And they became vital in the United States being able to secretly like communicate in order to kind of find success on their island hopping campaigns. So the Japanese could figure out all the other codes, but they could not figure out the Navajo language, and so they used them for that. Others worked in defense industries, and they're moving off reservations, right? So they're discovering their opportunities, they're leaving the poverty and the alcoholism, and they are not returning. They're kind of moving on. They were just recently, not many Navajo code talkers are left, and they were honored by President Trump at the White House. Now, Japanese Americans, kind of one of the stains in American history. 20,000 native-born Japanese Americans served loyally within the military, but because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, many Japanese Americans were suspected of being spies, unfortunately. And a lot of people on the West Coast believed that the Japanese were going to try and invade the West Coast, that it was imminent, that it was a serious threat. And so by 1942, these irrational fears, the racism, because remember that the Japanese Americans have been discriminated against in California, especially for decades now. And so FDR issues Executive Order 9906, and it basically says if you live past a certain line, most of the people were in Washington State, Oregon, and California, you needed to move and be put on internment camps. Most of them were in like Colorado, Wyoming, but there was basically a line that was drawn right around the Rocky Mountains where no person of Japanese descent could live. They left their businesses, their homes vacant. They were just gone. They lost everything, and they lived in these camps for years. Now, in 1944, Korematsu sued and basically saying that his civil rights were being violated because of this, and he was being discriminated unjustly, his constitutional rights. And the Supreme Court upheld the policy, right? So they said, no, it was okay because it was during wartime. This is what they felt like they needed to do. This is a continuity in American history. We've talked about it a lot. Civil liberties are limited during times of war. I think I heard a rumor, I don't know if it's true, but they were talking about possibly, I guess, in order to like, if they need to force quarantine or force the isolation and all of that within the states, like if the coronavirus gets that bad, that they were talking about, the Department of Justice was talking to Congress about allowing for that to happen. I think that's a little extreme, but I don't really think we're at war right now. But in 1988, the federal government did agree that the ruling was unjust, and they did pay damages to those people that were still alive, but too little too late. I'm hoping to do an assignment with that next week. All right, for women, 200,000 women are going to serve in non-combat roles in the Women's Army Corps, or WWII. They were nurses, drivers, they operated equipment, they were electricians. African American women also served. They served in segregated units. And their number one job, so they were deployed in the United States, but also in Europe. And their job was sorting U.S. mail between troops and their families. 5 million American women joined the workforce, and they're working in those factory jobs, shipyards, defense plants. The number of married women working increased to up to 24%, but they're still getting paid less than men. This is where we have the famous Rosie the Riveter piece of propaganda. Now, Rosie is she is based on a woman that was met by the artist, but her name was not Rosie. She just kind of symbolizes women in general during that time period. And again, so think about the point of view here, think about, or the purpose of it, and who the intended audience is, right? So you need to do your part, protect your men, right? And that's kind of the idea. So 1944, FDR decides to run for re-election again. He wins his 4th term. This time he's got Harry Truman as his vice president. And he's going to defeat Thomas Dewey with 53% of the popular vote. And you can still see that he is winning most of the states within the Electoral College. And again, this is that New Deal coalition that we talked about in the last chapter. Okay, so that is it for part 2 of World War II lecture. In the next lecture, I will talk about the battles and the different theaters of war, and then the effects of the war briefly.